This idea expired in 1994. The officer laughed, holding up the tattered military card. The old man stood silent, saying nothing. The young lieutenant added, "Want to enter the base? You need to be a real soldier." But minutes later, the phone rang. The person on the other end said just one sentence. "We're talking about the former commander of Special Forces Bravo team," who really didn't know who they were speaking to. "Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened." Nathan Rourke, approximately 80 years old, moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. His thin frame was wrapped in modest but immaculately clean clothing, pressed khaki pants, a simple blue button-up shirt, and a weathered brown jacket that had clearly seen many seasons. Despite his age, he stood remarkably straight, a habit forged through decades of military bearing. On this crisp Veterans Day morning, Rourke approached the main entrance of Camp Westbridge, an army base nestled in the Arizona desert. The facility was hosting its annual memorial service, an event Rourke had never attended, despite living just 30 miles away for the past 40 years. In his right hand, he clutched two items: a military identification card so old its edges had softened like well-loved book pages, and a stiff envelope, sealed with what appeared to be official government tape. His expression remained neutral as he approached the checkpoint. Eyes forward, steps measured. "Good morning," Rourke said to the guard, his voice quiet but clear. "I'd like to visit the memorial site inside the base." Lieutenant Adams, the 26-year-old officer manning the security checkpoint, extended his hand for Rourke's identification. Young, ambitious, and somewhat bored with checkpoint duty, Adams had been stationed at Camp Westbridge for less than a year. He took the ID card, immediately noticing its ancient appearance. "Sir, this expired in 1994, Adams said, squinting at the faded text. A slight smirk formed at the corners of his mouth as he held up the card. "You can't possibly think this is still valid?" Rourke didn't respond. He simply stood there, his weathered face showing neither anger nor embarrassment, just a patient weariness that seemed to run bone deep. "We get this all the time," said Sergeant Tran, another guard who had wandered over from his post. "People thinking they can use ancient IDs or fake military credentials." Tran was built like a linebacker, with a voice that carried across the checkpoint. Rourke remained silent, politely extending his hand to receive his ID back from Adams, who was now openly chuckling. "Look, if you want to enter a military installation, you need valid identification," Adams continued, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "You need to be an actual soldier, not just someone with an old card." A small crowd of other guards and personnel had gathered, drawn by Tran's booming commentary. Most showed amused expressions. A few looked uncomfortable, but none intervened. Rourke nodded once, pocketed his ID and envelope, and turned to leave, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He didn't argue or try to explain, he simply accepted their judgment, and began walking back toward the public parking area. From inside the guard booth, a young private named Ben Ramirez had witnessed the entire exchange. Unlike the others, he hadn't laughed. Something about the old man's dignified silence had struck him as unusual. Most people would argue, get angry, or try to explain themselves, but Rourke had simply accepted the dismissal with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place. Rick had been working in logistics for just 6 months, his first posting after basic training. As the son of a career military man, he'd grown up hearing stories about the old guard, the quiet professionals who had served during the Cold War in Vietnam. Something about Rourke's demeanor reminded him of those stories. When the other guards returned to their posts, Rick slipped into the back room and pulled out his phone. His uncle worked at the Pentagon in personnel records. Maybe he could shed some light on this. "Uncle Jim, it's Rick." "Yeah, I'm good. Listen, something strange just happened." An elderly man tried to enter the base with a military ID from the 90s. Most of the guys laughed him off, but something doesn't feel right. He didn't act like the homeless vets we sometimes get. This guy was different. "Could you maybe check a name for Nathan Rourke, probably commissioned in the 70s or earlier?" As Rick ended the call, he glanced through the window at Rourke's retreating figure. The old man had stopped by a bench outside the gate, not leaving yet, just sitting patiently as though waiting for something. "When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains," Rick murmured to himself, an old saying his father often repeated. When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains. Want to know what happened next? News of the incident at the gate spread quickly through the base's morning shift. Rosa Santiago, who had worked in the base cafeteria for over 30 years, overheard several guards laughing about the old-timer with the ancient ID as they grabbed coffee. What did this man look like? Rosa asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Skinny old guy, maybe 80. Super straight posture. One guard replied, had an ID from 94. Can you believe that? Rosa's expression changed immediately. Was he wearing a brown jacket? Quiet manner didn't argue. Yeah, that's him. You know this guy. Rosa nodded slowly. I've seen him before, just once. Back in 19. There was a fire in the weapons depot. 3 men were trapped inside. That man walked straight into the smoke and dragged them out, one by one. I never knew his name, but I never forgot his face. The guard looked skeptical. Come on, Rosa. That would make him some kind of hero. Heroes don't get turned away at gates. Rosa shrugged. Just telling you what I saw. Ask Colonel Price if you don't believe me. He was one of the men pulled out. Word continued to spread. A junior communications officer, who had overheard Rosa, took a grainy photo of Rourke sitting on the bench outside the gate and uploaded it to the base internal messaging system with the caption, "Anyone know this veteran? Turned away at gate, but Rosa says he saved lives in the 89D." Responses began trickling in immediately. That looks like the guy in the old photo in Colonel Price's office. My dad served in the 70s. Says that could be Nathan Rourke, but thought he died years ago. Wasn't there a Nathan Rourke who received a classified commendation during Vietnam? Meanwhile, Ben Ramirez waited anxiously by the staff phone. 20 minutes after his call to the Pentagon, it rang sharply. Rick answered on the first ring. Private Ramirez, this is Colonel Harlan, from the Pentagon. I need to speak with the commanding officer of your security checkpoint immediately. Put me on speaker. Rick's heart raced as he called Lieutenant Adams over. Sir, call from the Pentagon. They're asking for you. Adams straightened his uniform, a look of confusion crossing his face. This is Lieutenant Adams. Lieutenant, this is Colonel James Harlan, Special Operations Historical Division. Put this call on speaker immediately. Adams complied, his face showing growing concern. The room fell silent as Colonel Harlan's authoritative voice filled the small security office. The man you just turned away at your gate is retired Colonel Arthur E. Rourke, former commander of Special Forces Bravo Team from 1971. Sergeant Tran, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened immediately. Lieutenant Adams's face drained of color. Sir, we didn't know. Adams stammered. Clearly Harlan cut him off. Colonel Rourke is there for the annual memorial service, which he has every right to attend. He commanded the most successful extraction unit in Vietnam, and later led the Cambodia prisoner rescue mission. In 1975, a collective gasp swept through the room. The Cambodia mission was legendary, though most of the details remain classified. Rumors had circulated for decades about a small team that had rescued 28 American POWs from a camp deep in hostile territory without losing a single man. A vehicle is already en route to your location, Harlan continued. I suggest you extend every courtesy to Colonel Rourke until it arrives. As if on cue, a black military SUV pulled up to the gate. 3 senior officers emerged, moving with urgent purpose. The highest ranking among them, a full bird colonel with rows of combat ribbons, approached the checkpoint. I'm Colonel DeWitt. Where is Nathan Rourke? Adams pointed wordlessly to the bench outside. Colonel DeWitt nodded curtly and strode towards Rourke, the other officers following close behind. Rick moved to the window, watching as Colonel DeWitt approached Rourke and rendered a crisp salute. Rourke rose slowly and returned. Words were exchanged, hands were shaken, and Rourke nodded, retrieving the envelope from his pocket and handing it to DeWitt. 15 minutes later, Rourke and the officers returned to the gate. This time Lieutenant Adams and Sergeant Tran stood at rigid attention. These gentlemen will be entering the base under my authorization, Colonel DeWitt announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. As they passed through, Colonel DeWitt paused and turned to the security team. For your information, that ID card you mocked contains an embedded transmitter. Colonel Rourke activates it, exactly once per year, on Veterans Day, to signal he's still with us. We monitor for that signal specifically. Adams swallowed hard. Sir, I had no idea. No, you didn't, DeWitt agreed coldly. You saw an old man with an expired ID and made assumption. That man commanded operations you'll never have clearance to read about. He saved more American lives than everyone at this checkpoint combined. After the group had moved out of earshot, Rick turned to Adams. Sir, what just happened? Adams ran a hand over his face. We just insulted a living legend. That's what happened. Tran shook his head in disbelief. Cambodia rescue mission. That's like finding out you yelled at Rambo. Rick's uncle called back later that morning, his voice tight with concern. Do you have any idea who that was? Nathan Rourke isn't just some retired colonel. After Vietnam, He ran the most classified extraction unit in military history. His operations are still redacted in official records. Why would someone like that just accept being turned away? Rick asked. He didn't even argue. There was a long pause before his uncle answered. Men like Rourke, they don't need to prove themselves to anyone. They know who they are. That's what made them so effective. Absolute absence of ego. The mission was everything. As the day progressed, more information filtered down through unofficial channels. Rourke had lived quietly in a small Arizona town since his retirement, refusing interviews and declining to appear at military functions. Today was the first time in decades he had attempted to visit a military installation. The envelope he had brought contained personal letters to the families of men lost under his command, men whose names appeared on the memorial inside the base. For 40 years, he had written these letters annually, but never delivered them in person. Until today. I don't know about you, but this part really hit me. Type respect if it moved you too. By noon, Camp Westbridge was buzzing with unprecedented activity. The base commander had issued an emergency protocol. Prepare an honor reception for Colonel Nathan Rourke. Word spread rapidly through the ranks. Soldiers who had been performing routine duties found themselves hastily assembling along the main thoroughfare. An honor guard was quickly organized. Dress uniforms were donned, and the memorial site, Rourke's original destination, was prepared for a distinguished visitor. Lieutenant Adams, still shaken by the morning's events, stood rigidly at his post, watching as the procession returned from wherever they had taken Rourke. The old colonel still wore his simple civilian clothes. He had declined the offer of formal military attire, but even in his modest outfit, Rourke carried himself with an unmistakable presence that commanded respect. As Rourke approached the gate once more, an extraordinary scene unfolded. Every soldier present snapped to attention, rendering a salute that would normally be reserved for the highest-ranking generals. Rourke returned the gesture with practiced precision, his weathered hand moving with the muscle memory of countless such exchanges. The base's internal communication channels exploded with activity. Urgent. All personnel be advised. Colonel Arthur E. Rourke, retired, is on base for memorial visit. Full honors protocol in effect. Alert. The Pentagon call incident involves decorated Special Forces commander. Show appropriate respect. Reminder. Media blackout in effect regarding Colonel Rourke's presence on base. On veteran forums connected to Camp Westbridge, messages began circulating rapidly. Rourke is alive? The Nathan Rourke? I thought he died years ago. My father served under him and said Rourke was the finest officer he ever knew. This is the man who never left anyone behind, ever. The base's digital bulletin board filled with first-hand accounts from older veterans who had served with or under Rourke's command. I was a radio operator in Vietnam when Rourke led an extraction. We were pinned down for 72 hours. He never slept, never complained, just kept us alive until extraction was possible. Rourke refused a Silver Star and said the mission was the reward. I've never met anyone who embodied the warrior ethos like Nathan Rourke. Not before, not since. Lieutenant Adams, after being relieved from his post by another officer, sought out Colonel Rourke. He found him at the memorial wall standing silently before a section dedicated to operations in Southeast Asia. Adams approached hesitantly, his shame evident in every Colonel Rourke, sir, Adams began, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to apologize for my behavior this morning. I was disrespectful and judgmental. Rourke turned slowly, studying the young officer without expression. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. You were doing your job, Lieutenant? No, sir. I was following procedure, but I wasn't doing my job. My job is to protect this base while showing respect to those who've served. I failed at that. Rourke considered this. The fault isn't yours. It's in how you were trained to see people. Adams looked confused. Sir, in my day, Rourke explained, we were taught to evaluate the man, not just his credentials. That's been lost somewhere along the way. This simple observation struck Adams with the force of a physical blow. He had been so focused on rules and protocols that he had forgotten to see the human being standing before him. By early afternoon, the base commander had arranged an impromptu gathering in the main auditorium. Over 200 personnel, mostly young recruits who had never heard of Nathan Rourke before today, filled the seats while senior officers lined the walls. The base commander, a two-star general who had specifically flown in when he heard Rourke was on base, stepped to the podium. Today we have an unexpected honor. With us is Colonel Nathan Rourke, whose service record remains partially classified even today. Colonel Rourke has agreed to say a few words to our newest service members. A murmur ran through the crowd as Rourke made his way to the stage. He moved slowly but purposefully, his tall frame still impressive despite his advanced age. When he reached the podium, he surveyed the room silently for a moment. "I didn't come here for recognition," he began, his voice soft but carrying easily through the hushed room. "I came to pay respects to men who didn't make it home. Men whose names are on that wall outside." Rourke paused, his gaze moving across the young faces. "You asked me to speak to these recruits. I'll say only this. Honor isn't in the uniform or the rank, or the ID card. Honor is how you conduct yourself when no one is watching. It's the promises you keep when keeping them is hard." The room remained completely silent as Rourke continued. "I've never spoken publicly about my service, not because it was classified, but because the work itself was what mattered, not who did it. The men I served with understood that. We didn't need recognition, because we had each other's respect, and that was enough." Rourke's eyes found Lieutenant Adams at the back of the room. "This young man at the gate this morning. He did what he thought was right based on what he could see. I don't fault him for that, but I would ask all of you to remember, sometimes the most important things aren't visible on the surface." After the speech, as Rourke made his way through the crowd of officers and enlisted personnel wanting to shake his hand, Sergeant Tran approached, visibly emotional. "Sir, my father was at Cam Bay in 7. He always said a colonel named Rourke arranged the extraction that saved his unit." "Was that you?" Rourke studied the sergeant's face for a moment. "What was your father's name?" "Son, Carlos Tran, sir, 5th Infantry." Rourke nodded slowly. "I remember the operation. Your father was brave. He helped carry 2 wounded men to the extraction point." Tran's eyes wide. "He never told me that part. The brave ones rarely talk about it," Rourke replied simply. As the day progressed, an unexpected gesture emerged from the base security team. Lieutenant Adams, after consulting with his superior officers, ordered a small bronze plaque to be made and installed at the checkpoint where Rourke had been turned away that morning. It would read, "Rourke Gate, in honor of Quiet Valor." By late afternoon, as Rourke prepared to leave the base, he was approached by a senior intelligence officer, who had flown in from Washington. "Colonel, there's something you should know," the officer said quietly. "Those letters you've been writing all these years to the family, they've been delivered, all of them." Rourke looked genuinely surprised for the first time that day. "How? I never sent them." "No, but you wrote the names and addresses on the envelopes. After you were identified in our monitoring system each year, we would send someone to check on you. They reported the letters. We made sure they reached their destinations." Rourke stood perfectly still, absorbing this information. For decades he had written annual letters to the families of men lost under his command, believing them to be a private act of remembrance and responsibility. To learn that these messages had actually reached their intended recipients visibly moved him. "The Sullivan family in Oregon? The Williamses in Georgia?" Rourke asked. The officer nodded. "All of them, every year. Some of those families have kept every letter you ever wrote them." As the sun began to set over Camp Westbridge, Rourke stood once more at the memorial wall, his fingers tracing names etched in stone. A small group of officers stood at a respectful distance, watching as this living legend paid his respects to fallen comrades. When he finally turned to leave, Rourke said something to the base commander that would later be inscribed on the plaque at the newly named Rourke Gate. "I came only to visit those I couldn't save." That evening, as Rourke was escorted off base with full honors, Lieutenant Adams stood at attention at the gate, rendering a perfect salute. As Rourke's vehicle passed, the old colonel met Adams's eyes and returned the salute with dignified precision. In that silent exchange was an understanding that transcended the morning's misunderstanding, a recognition that honor, once earned, cannot be dimmed by time or circumstance. What moment in your life did justice arrive late, but was still sweet? In the months that followed, Nathan Rourke returned to his quiet life in the small Arizona town, where he had lived anonymously for decades. He declined all interview requests, and politely refused the various honors that military organizations wanted to bestow upon him. His story, however, took on a life of its own. The Pentagon call incident, as it became known within military circles, transformed into a teaching moment at officer training schools across the country. Without identifying Rourke by name, at his request, the scenario was presented as a case study in the difference between following protocol and exercising true leadership. True to his word, Lieutenant Adams ensured that the bronze plaque was installed at the checkpoint. It bore the simple inscription Rourke had requested. "Honor endures long after credentials expire." Rourke's expired military ID card, the very one that had caused such dismissal and then reverence, was placed in a small display case in Camp Westbridge's historical collection. Beside it,
A placard explained that this unassuming piece of plastic had belonged to one of the most decorated special operations commanders in modern military history. The display included no details of Rourke's missions, respecting both classified information and his personal wishes, but concluded with the line, "An expired ID, but honor that never will." On the following Veterans Day, a black SUV once again appeared at Rourke's modest home. This time, however, he was expected. The tradition would continue for the remaining years of his life, a quiet acknowledgement of his ongoing place in the military family he had served so faithfully. Ben Ramirez, the young private, whose call had set the day's events in motion, received an unexpected transfer to officer candidate school with a personal recommendation from a Pentagon colonel. During his graduation ceremony, he shared the lesson that had changed his perspective on military service. Never judge a warrior by the date on a plastic card. Judge them by the honor in their action. When asked years later about that remarkable Veterans Day, Lieutenant Adams, by then Captain Adams, would reflect, "Some badges don't need to be worn. They're already engraved in blood and courage." He would often add, for the benefit of young officers under his command, sometimes the person you're dismissing is the very one who once protected you from things you've never had to understand. As for Colonel Nathan Rourke, he continued writing his annual letters, now knowing they would reach their destinations. Nathan Rourke had never needed recognition, only remembrance, and in that moment at the gate, what had once been invisible became unmistakable. True honor isn't loud, and it doesn't fade with age. It lives on in quiet conviction, in acts no one sees, and in the hearts of those who still believe in duty above applause. In his final letter, found on his desk after his passing at age 89, he had written, "Honor does not fade. It only needs one person to remember it. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up when you're doing what's right." What moment have you stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see that truth and justice ultimately prevail. Share this video with someone who needs faith in doing the right thing.